Time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have back with us live in the studios this morning, Randy Rowland. Randy Rowland is a local activist, a co-founder of Pepper Spray Productions, and an organizer of the Presidio 27 Mutiny, which took place October 14th, 1968 at the Presidio stockade in San Francisco, and he's here to talk about that. So start out, tell us how you basically became involved and an organizer at the Presidio about 50 years ago.
It was 50 years ago this year. I just came back from an anniversary event down in San Francisco, sponsored by the Presidio Museum, because the Presidio now is civilian-controlled. In those days, it was the headquarters of the 6th Army. So I joined the Army. I was one of those guys that was raised in a conservative family and believed in, service to country. I still believe in service to country as far as that goes. I believed in paying your dues for living in the country. So I joined the Army in 1967 and was a medic. I was ultimately stationed at Fort Lewis down just south of Tacoma. I spent about a year at Fort Lewis, I suppose. But something happened, and the something that happened was that I was taking care of the wounded. And their situation was so desperate and so horrible. I was taking care of people who had spinal cord injuries or head injuries, these guys are paralyzed, and they're 19 years old. Their girlfriend comes in once to visit them. It's so horrible that they never come back. They couldn't even kill themselves, and they would beg the medics to kill them because they were just so, wrenched out of shape. And that suffering really kind of moved me. But what also moved me was that none of those guys thought that they had made their sacrifice for a good cause. The reports that they were bringing back from the field in Vietnam was that the war wasn't worth fighting, that we weren't really there to protect America or save democracy or anything of this sort, but rather we were the oppressors, and that we were the ones who were mistreating people, burning down their houses, raping and looting and carnage and every kind of bad thing. Well, that stopped my show, you can bet, because, here these guys were, on the one hand, suffering immeasurably, and on the other hand, their report was that it was a bad war. Up until that moment, I hadn't really thought that was the case. I hadn't thought much about it one way or the other. I was just doing my duty like anybody's supposed to. But it did cause me to want to look into the war. And, it didn't take too long before I figured out that they were right. Of course they were right. They were the guys that had been there to know. And so the combination of their suffering plus the realization that the war was really wrong made me decide that I wanted to be a conscientious objector. I had trained with conscientious objectors down at, in Fort Sam Houston in Texas when I was, training to be a medic. And those guys had really struck me as really upright kind of people. They were really honorable kind of, their bearing was something I could really respect. I wasn't of their religious persuasion or any of that kind of stuff, and it wasn't like hanging out with those guys in training made me, at that point, want to be a conscientious objector. But I did respect them, and just for their morality, like decent kind of people that they were. And now, when all of a sudden, some time later, I was confronted with this sort of moral quandary of, like, this war is not right. America's not doing the right thing here. Well, I had to remember those guys, and that seemed like the reasonable thing to do. So one of the guys in the barracks was a fellow who was from New York, and he had a subscription to the Village Voice, which in those days was an underground paper and really, much more countercultural and more activist-oriented than the kind of things that we get these days. Excuse me. And when he was done with his Village Voice every week, he would hand it to me and I would read it, And there was this article in the Village Voice that was the Individuals Against the Crimes of Silence. And the concept was that was the whole notion of complicity. If you see something bad going on and you don't do something about it, then you're complicit. Then you're guilty of that bad thing too. And in this case, the bad thing was the war in Vietnam. And so what you were supposed to do is sign a little coupon and mail it into them, to take your stand against the war. By activist standards, it wasn't a very big step, but it was a first step for me. And I saw that, and I had been raised, in a Christian family, and the idea of complicity was not a foreign notion to me, and so I saw that, and I thought, so I signed it and sent it in. And I suppose that was my very first act of resistance, minor as it may be. Well, what happened, of course, is that some weeks later, I get this packet in the mail, and at Madigan General Hospital, the medics would eat their, our mess hall was actually the hospital cafeteria. And so we'd go there, and the mail room was right there. And so I went and checked my mail, got this little envelope, went and got my tray and sat down and with my buddies and opened it up. It was from the Individuals Against the Crimes of Silence. And of course, there was more flyers with the little coupons on them that I was supposed to pass out. And, hey, look at this, fellas. I just got this in the mail. And I passed it down, and next thing I knew, I was standing in front of my commander's desk, who was yelling at me because I was passing out literature on base in uniform. I didn't even know you couldn't do that. This is America. I thought you're, freedom of thought and all that kind of business. And I was genuinely shocked that he would be upset because I had shared this piece of mail with my buddies in the lunchroom. It just didn't make any sense to me. But he was yelling at me, and I said, it's America, And he says, but they're communists. Well, I was pretty sure they weren't communists, but, at that point it was like, well, if they're communists, maybe I'll have a different attitude, but I'm pretty sure, sir, they're not communists. And, that went on for a while, and, he didn't actually punish me, but he was a wake-up call that it was like one step after another. And bit by bit, I decided I had to be a conscientious objector, and I went to my commander, and I had a man-to-man kind of personal conversation with him. He was the guy you're supposed to go to for advice, and at least I so foolishly thought so in my youth. And so I went to him, and I said, well, I've decided I'm against all this stuff, and I don't want to get out of the Army. I believe in doing my duty, but I want to be a non-combatant. That is to say, one of those guys that doesn't carry a gun. I'm happy to carry the aid bag, but I'm not going to shoot somebody. I'm not going to put somebody else in the circumstance of the guys that I am currently taking care of in the hospital. I don't want to be that guy that is responsible for that level of suffering. At that point, I wasn't even really thinking about the Vietnamese. That was yet to come. But at that point, I was only thinking really about the suffering of the American soldiers, and I didn't want to be somebody that was putting somebody in that circumstance. And he says, Rowland, I'm never going to ask you to pick up a gun, so, you're working in a hospital, knock it off. Just don't bring trouble on yourself. Keep your head down and don't bring trouble on yourself and cause problems. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to do it. Please give me the application. And he begrudgingly gave me the application. I tried to find some help. I called a couple of, activist groups up in Seattle. Some strange GI calling them up. In those days, everybody thought the GIs were the enemy, I think. And so as far as the movement, and so nobody actually responded to help me in that regard. And I filled out my application, did a very poor job of it in retrospect, because I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't know that, there's, like everything, there's sort of magic words you got to say in order to get something approved. And I didn't know what the magic words were. I really didn't know what the standards were. I was ignorant. But I did the best I could and turned it in. And, of course, it came back rejected. And along came also my orders for Vietnam. And so once I got orders for Vietnam, then I got orders to go report to the firing range to familiarize myself with the M16. So I went up to my lieutenant and I said, you told me man to man that you would never ask me to pick up a gun, and here's these orders to go to the firing range. Now, what are you going to do about that? He says, well, I'm not going to tell you to pick up the gun. The major's going to tell you to pick up the gun. It's, of course, a bigger deal, of course, for a higher ranking officer to give you a command. So I really kind of felt betrayed. I had gone to him, as my superior officer and as the guy who's supposed to give me guidance, and I had sought the guidance and did the best I could, and now the guy was more or less just flipping me off. I went out to the firing range. By coincidence, one of my buddies happened to be at the firing range that day too. He was sitting next to me, and first you break down the weapon and you put it all back together, and so I wouldn't touch mine, but he was having trouble, so when they weren't looking, I would help him get his together and put it back down on the table, and that got him through it, but I wouldn't touch my weapon. I was always pretty good with that kind of stuff, so it wasn't a technical question for me, but and then they marched me out there, and sure enough, here comes some big officer and who ordered me to pick up the gun, and I refused. Well, I lost a couple stripes over that deal. I was an E4 at that point, so I lost a couple stripes over that deal. But they said, "Well, are you still willing to go to Vietnam?" I said, "Well, yeah. I'm just not going to carry a gun." So they took away some stripes, but it wasn't like I went to prison, which I could have. It's a 5-year crime, or at least the maximum sentence for refusing a direct order is 5 years. So they could have sent me to prison for 5 years right then. They didn't, but they did take a couple stripes away from me and confined me to barracks for a couple of weeks, which made me grumpy because I was married and I was so poor. The military doesn't pay that well, and certainly in those days they didn't. And so the way that I would go and steal food from the mess hall at noon, and then I would take that home, and that's what my wife ate in the evening. That's how poor we were. And so when I was confined to barracks, it meant that she didn't have a food source. And some of the old sergeants kind of helped out. I had good relations with them. But at any rate, so all of that kind of cleared up, and it was time to go on leave before I went to Vietnam. We drove down from Seattle or Tacoma. We drove down to the Bay Area, which is where soldiers went to Vietnam from Oakland, was the shipping point. And so I had 45 days before I was supposed to report to go to Vietnam. So we went down there and quickly enough fell in with activists, because by now I had sort of gone several steps down the road towards becoming an activist. And just about the first thing we saw, it was demonstrations at Berkeley where the police were really manhandling the protesters. And I saw a cop club a girl who was obviously pregnant. And something about that just pushed me over an edge. Because, not only had I heard that from the guys who had been wounded that the war was wrong, but here it was. They're beating up demonstrators. This is supposed to be America. They're beautiful. And the whole thing in those days was, well, you got to fight for freedom and democracy. And, this wasn't freedom and democracy. Look at what's going on in the streets of America. And I kind of was going further and further down the road. So I decided at a certain point, I said, I can't support this. I can't support this at all. And so, I was in the demonstrations, this is 1968, earlier in the summer. And my wife and I were in the demonstrations and whatever. And I was changing. And I decided I can't support this at all. I'm not going to go to Vietnam. I'm going to refuse. And I'll just take my lickings, and that's going to be that. And somebody said, well, you better get a lawyer. And so I did. I got this guy named Terry Hallinan, who was this really incredible movement activist lawyer. Later, he became the DA or something for San Francisco years later, and was really strong on marijuana issues and very good, really people's kind of guy. So Terry said, well, you're on orders, but technically, don't refuse to get on the airplane because that's a 5-year crime. And the last guy that refused to get on the airplane, they just threw him in handcuffs and threw him on the airplane. And it's kind of hard to defend a guy when he's in Vietnam and his lawyer's in the United States. So just as a tactic, just don't show up because after 45 days, they'll drop you from the rolls. And then, you're going to get punished for AWOL, but that's a relatively small punishment. And it gives me time to do a proper conscientious objector application. I said, okay. There was a lot of adventures. I ended up having to live underground in the woods of Northern California after a couple of really close calls with the police. And but finally the time came up, and it was my 45 days of AWOL was just about up, and so I came back into the city, met up with Terry, and he said, Terry Hallinan, and he said, well, there's this big demonstration coming up, GIs and vets against the war. It's going to be on October 12th. He says, this is coming up in a week or two. And so if as a 2-for-1 sale, if you want to kind of really max out on your stand and stuff, then, how about, he says, I've got a couple other guys that are AWOL, and you can all turn yourselves in sort of ceremoniously at the end of this march. Get a little publicity. There had been just before that a group of soldiers, the 9 for Peace, 9 guys that had chained, each guy had chained themselves to a clergyman in the Bay Area and taken sanctuary in a church. And it had gotten a lot of publicity. And it was because so much of the war effort at that point was, well, you've got to support the war because you've got to support the troops. But the troops were turning against the war big time. But the public really hadn't really grasped that, I don't think, yet. But that was the reality, is that the soldiers had decided, their verdict on the war was that the war was wrong. We weren't really doing the right thing. Because, burning down people's houses and raping their daughters is not, that's not the right thing. So, at any rate, Terry Hallinan says, we'll do something kind of like the 9 for Peace, and so we'll have you guys turn yourselves in at the end of this big march. So, okay. And the march was an important march because it was really a turning point for the budding GI movement. Which was only in those months was the first time anybody was even talking about it as a movement. Before that, it had been a few individual guys doing their stand, taking doing things as kind of a question of conscience. But it was isolated cases, and now all of a sudden, GIs were starting to get a sense that there was a lot of GIs who were against the war, and it was a movement. We were a movement, and boy, there's a lot of power in that, But the public really hadn't caught on to that. And it was still, support the troops, support the war to sort of support the troops. And so here comes the GI and Vets March Against the War in San Francisco in 1968, October 12th. And as part of it, 3 other guys, myself, 4 of us, marched along. And then at the end of the march, we sort of ceremoniously turned ourselves in at the Presidio, which was the military base in San Francisco. And, and the plan was that, I'd, go to the stockade and, get my punishment for AWOL, and Terry would, do a better job of my conscience objector application, which I had been working on all summer. Well, that march was going to happen on Saturday. And on Friday, just by coincidence, on Friday, a prisoner at the stockade at the Presidio was shotgunned, and he was shot in the back by a shotgun guard on a work detail. The prisoner had mental problems and was, skipping around and suicidal. It was death by a shotgun guard. He taunted the guard and then skipped around, and the guard just leveled on him and shot him, killed him. So Friday night there was a riot in the stockade by their other prisoners because the stockade conditions, I didn't know because I wasn't in there yet, but the stockade conditions were very bad. It was way overcrowded. It was built to hold 60. There was 120 people in there. It was, somebody was stealing the rations, and so food was scarce, and treatment of the prisoners was very, very bad. A lot of, really physical torture, really. And so the conditions in the stockade were bad, and now they shot and killed this prisoner. So we were all in a meeting Friday night because the next day was the day that the big march was going to happen. And Terry says, well, he explained what had happened. And he says, you're going to go to the stockade tomorrow anyway. So when you go in there, why don't you see, kind of what's going on. And, it'll be Saturday afternoon or evening, and you can kind of assess the situation. And also, those guys might want to take it to a higher level. They already did their riot, and that's fine, but, they might want to do something more political, more conscious. It's okay. So Saturday was the big march. There was hundreds of GIs that marched on the march. I mean, hundreds of GIs. They passed out little soda jerk hats, those little paper hats, because, you weren't supposed to march in uniform. Some did, like most famously Susan Schnall, who was a Navy nurse who had leafleted the bases by flying over in a rented plane and dropping leaflets out. And then she marched in uniform and spoke from the speaker stand in uniform, for which she was court-martialed later. But there was others in uniform, but then there was hundreds of them that were wearing the little paper hats, because since you weren't supposed to march in uniform, how could anybody tell you were a GI? And so the paper hat was supposed to denote it. And if you look at archival photos, there were hundreds of people with the paper hats on marching in the march. And, of course, tons of vets and a whole bunch of civilians. It was a very large march. And it was really marked a turning point in how things were in the movement against the war. I turned myself in, but then they didn't throw me in the stockade. I was like, well, I thought you guys were going to throw me in the stockade, and they didn't. And so, my mission was to go in there and see if I couldn't organize something in response to this shotgun murder. But I wasn't in the stockade. So Saturday evening, about maybe 6 o'clock in the evening, it was November, so it was dark, and it was quiet, and I was in this holding company, and there was nothing going on. But there was the old sergeant down there in the orderly room, which is like the business office that, there's somebody in there 24 hours a day in case, your grandma dies or something. They have to call you for an emergency or whatever. There's always somebody on duty in the orderly room. So the old sergeant was down there reading a Playboy magazine or whatever, and, nobody else is around. It's dark and quiet. And I walked in there, and I walked up to him, and I said, I'm refusing to sweep this floor on grounds of conscience. And he goes, what? And he's like, his face turns red, and he totally bit the hook. And he handcuffed me to this chair, which I easily could have picked up and walked out with. It's just like a little chair. But and 30 minutes later, I was in the stockade, and I walked into the cell block, and I announced in a loud voice, I'm from the movement, and I'm here to see if we can't organize something about that guy getting killed. And 30 guys in the cell block go, cool. And we immediately started having the meeting. And if you think about it, these days, to walk into a room full of strangers and just say, I'm from the movement, and let's see if we can't organize something, and everybody just said, cool. But that's what happened. And so I linked up with one of the Nine for Peace, this guy, Keith Mather, who I had met briefly before he had gone and done his thing, and now he was in the stockade. And so I linked up with Keith, and we started having the meetings. This was on Saturday evening. On Monday morning, we sat down. What happened was that we had come up with a plan. We'd made our demands, which of course had to do with stockade conditions and the murder of the guy. We wanted psychological profiles of the guards who were, not trained as guards. Mostly they were just like back from Vietnam and stoned on acid, and just as messed up as anybody else. And there were all kind of incidents. The guard shooting a hole in the roof of the guard shack because he was playing with his shotgun one night, and different, all kinds of weird stuff going on. It was a hellhole. I mean, frankly, it was like a crazy house. And but at any rate, so on a prearranged signal, which was the first name that they would call on roll call formation on Monday morning, we waited till Monday because we had to have time to organize, and we wanted the press to show up, and the plan was that the press would show up. Terry had come in on Sunday to visit me as my lawyer, and I had told him what the plan was and everything, and he was going to arrange for the press. Well, the press didn't show up because they got stopped at the gate because a snitch had told the brass what was going on, so they knew full well. So on the Monday morning, the first name was called at roll call formation, and we broke ranks. And 27 of us went over and sat down in a little place in the stockade yard there, inside the fence, where there was the one and only spot that was really visible from outside. So we chose that spot thinking that the press was going to show up. We wanted to be visible. And so we sat down and we linked arms and we started singing We Shall Overcome, which we tried a couple other songs, but nobody knew the words to them. And so, This Land Is Your Land or whatever, but nobody knew the words. And so we kind of always went back to We Shall Overcome. The commandant came up with some of the guard staff and everything, and he read us the Mutiny article, and we just sang sang louder so that we couldn't hear him, and this and that, and ultimately, they brought the fire truck up, and they were going to have them escort us. But the firemen were civilians, and the fire chief says, that's not our job. Those guys are sitting there singing, "We shall overcome. This is not a crisis. We're not going to squirt them." So they refused. So they brought in a company of MPs with their gas masks and this and that. We thought maybe they're going to gas us, but we hadn't really organized an exit. We had figured out we had made the plan for how to start the thing, but in all honesty, we never got around to figuring out how to end it. So we just kept singing and linking arms and trying to be as brave as we could. And it was a wildly elated kind of moment, really, because there we were actually doing something in an organized fashion, kind of breaking through. But ultimately, the MPs came in and grabbed us and drug us back into the cell blocks and threw us all in a cell, and that was the end of the protest. Well, we were charged with mutiny, which is a capital crime. It's the most serious military offense. Mutiny, the way that the military regulations for all the services are the same, and they define mutiny as an act where you try to usurp military authority in concert with others, and it's the in concert with others part. The military brass know full well that one guy doing something is relatively easy to deal with, right? You can overcome that easy enough. But as soon as you get multiple people acting in concert with each other, then there's power. And throughout history, military authorities have certainly understood that, which is why they define mutiny as the most serious military offense. The way the regulations say there is no maximum sentence, which of course means that it's a capital crime. So we were facing the death sentence for singing "We Shall Overcome." The commandant of the 6th Army, this guy, General Larson, later said in an interview that they thought the revolution was starting, and they wanted to set an example, make an example of us, which is kind of a classic military tactic anyway. Every ship that would ever leave the port, as soon as somebody would do a minor infraction, the captain would have them whipped so that all the rest of the sailors would know that the captain meant business and he was a tough guy, and they'd pull their horns in. And so there was nothing new about that tactic of trying to make an example out of somebody. And we were the guys. And, they really, the mutiny was the GI movement. All of a sudden in concert, here were soldiers in concert planning demonstrations, starting GI underground newspapers, doing all kinds of stuff. And it was a very, early stages of that, but it's very infectious. And there was a sense all of a sudden that we were a movement, and that was very, very threatening to the military authorities and to the power structure behind the military, because we were in the middle of a war. Well, so that was that. The end result was that we got convicted. We went to prison, but for anybody that thinks that those, free Mumia or free so-and-so, Angela Davis or free somebody or other, that those campaigns can't work, well, that's not true, because I'm sitting here today because that campaign did work for us. And the outrage and outcry of soldiers who had sang "We Shall Overcome" in a peaceful, nonviolent demonstration, being charged with a capital crime of mutiny and convicted. And the original sentences were 16 years and stuff for guys that we thought were going to get off easy. I wasn't one of the first ones to be tried, and I was one of the ringleaders, and so I was pretty sure I was going to get a lot worse sentence than that. But the outcry was such that we sorry, my phone just went off. The outcry was such that the sentences were reduced. I ended up doing 1.5 years in prison, which was an interesting experience, of course. But it did turn me into a lifelong activist.
And unfortunately, we're out of time, and here we are a day before the 100th anniversary of what they like to call Veterans Day, but really is Armistice Day.
Exactly. It's the Veterans for Peace chapter in Seattle and across the country has been campaigning to bring back Armistice Day. 100 years ago, Armistice Day was at the end of World War I. Armistice Day, which was before the actual technical peace treaty, but it was the cessation of violence, of firing and warfare, was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. So that was when the World War I ended. And so the concept, which ultimately became Armistice Day, was that it was a day dedicated to peace. Now, by the time the Korean War was over, and the Armistice, which was the way they ended the Korean War, had an unfortunate name, was the Armistice, and the Hawks in the United States didn't want to celebrate Armistice Day anymore. They were trying to beat the drums of war, and so they got under Eisenhower, they changed it to Veterans Day, and now it's a celebration of war, sadly, when it was originally a celebration of peace. So we really been campaigning as who better to bring back Armistice Day than the veterans themselves, and so the celebration is now spreading around the country, and that's this weekend.
All right. And well, talking with Randy Rowland, and people can find out more about Veterans for Peace at their website.
That's right, which is, just Google Veterans for Peace.
Do a lot of great work. So with that, we're unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you.